Hola amigos y bienvenidos a mi canal. My name's Austin and today's video is the first in a series on Spanish verb conjugation. Today we're going to talk about when to use and how to conjugate one of the most commonly used Spanish tenses, the indicative present, also called the simple present tense. This tense is used to indicate what is happening in the present moment, and it's the one you'll probably be using the most often when you go to conjugate Spanish verbs. So we want to make sure we have a good understanding of how to use it. All Spanish verbs can be classified as either regular or irregular, and are all structured the same in their infinitive form. Infinitive simply means that the verb hasn't yet been conjugated into any tense. All verbs, whether or not they're regular, will end with one of three endings in their infinitive: AR, ER, and IR. For regular verbs, these endings are the only part that needs to be changed to conjugate properly. One thing that we should always remember when we're talking about verb conjugation in any tense is that Spanish has a lot of irregular verbs. In the present tense, there are basically two parts of the word that will be irregular: the stem in the middle and the end of the word. Now, I'll talk more about irregular verbs as we get into specific examples, but first, I want to discuss regular verbs. I've created a spreadsheet that helps with understanding usage and conjugation of all the Spanish verb tenses, so I'll be referencing that often during these videos. Now, before we get too far, we need to make sure that we understand the subject that's going to be used to conjugate the verb. I have a video up on all the various subjects used in Spanish, and you can find that video here. Now, if you haven't seen that video yet, I suggest you check it out to make sure you're familiar with the subjects we're about to use. Remember that the subject will oftentimes not be used in sentences where the conjugation of the verb already tells us who the subject is. Alright, so let's start learning how to conjugate our regular verbs in Spanish, beginning with the AR verbs. In Spanish, verbs ending in AR in their infinitive form are the most likely to use a regular conjugation. To conjugate these regular verbs, we start by dropping the AR at the end of the word, and we simply place the ending that corresponds to the subject. For yo, we replace the AR ending with an O ending. For tú, we replace AR with as. For vos, we replace AR with as with an accent on the A. For él, ella, and usted, we replace AR with a. For nosotros and nosotras, we use amos. For vosotros and vosotras, we use ais, also with an accented A. For ellos, ellas, and ustedes, we replace the AR with on. Good so far? Next up, we've got the regular ER verbs. We'll start the same way as the AR verbs by dropping the ER to replace with the appropriate ending. Conjugation for these verbs is the exact same as the previous conjugations, except we use an E in place of an A. Yo conjugations still end with O, but tú now ends with S. Vos with S with an accent on the E. Él, ella, and usted now end with E. Nosotros and nosotras now use hemos. Vosotros and vosotras now use es with an accented E. And ellos, ellas, and ustedes use en. Lastly, we have the regular IR verbs. Conjugation here is going to be mostly the same as with the ER verbs, with some changes. Yo still ends with O. Tú still ends with S. But vos instead uses is with an accented I. Él, ella, and usted still use e. And ellos, ellas, and ustedes still use en. Nosotros and nosotras in this case will use imos, and vosotros and vosotras will end with is with an accented I. Alright, now let's take a bit of time to practice conjugating some regular verbs. I'm going to give you a subject and a regular verb and see if you can match up the proper conjugation. Ready? How do we conjugate hablar with yo? If you got hablo, well done. That's perfect. How about comer with nosotros? Comemos. All right, now for a long one. How do we conjugate sobrealimentar with ellos? It's sobrealimentan. Did you get that last one? It was kind of a hard one, right? Well, not really, because you still only have to change the ending of the word, and everything else is still exactly the same. Now, I know that's a lot of conjugations to learn, and it might be pretty overwhelming at first, but the more you practice them, the easier it's going to get. Spanish is a language that's absolutely full of patterns, and these patterns will start to feel like second nature after enough time practicing. Now that we've talked about how to conjugate our regular verbs in the indicative present, let's talk a bit about irregular verbs. The point of this next section is not to teach you every conjugation for every irregular verb, which would take a long time, but rather to open your eyes on some patterns you'll find with nearly all irregular Spanish verbs. You might remember from earlier in the video that there are two primary ways that verbs can be irregular in Spanish. They can change their stem, or they can take on a different ending. The bad news is that you're simply going to have to memorize these verbs in order to conjugate them correctly. Sorry. The good news is that some of the most irregular verbs in Spanish are also some of the most commonly used, so you'll be using them often enough to remember their conjugations. On top of that, many irregular verbs are actually root words used in lots of other verbs which follow the same conjugation patterns. For example, the verb tener, to have, is the root word in the following verbs. Obtener, to obtain. Detener, to stop. Mantener, to maintain. Abstenerse, to abstain. Contener, to contain. Entretener, to entertain. Retener, to retain. And finally, sostener, to hold. Once you know how to conjugate tener, you'll know how to conjugate all of these verbs without learning any new patterns. Pretty cool, right? So, what makes our irregular verbs so irregular anyway? Let's start with our stem changers, which are verbs where the vowel used in the middle of the verb is changed to another sound when it's conjugated. Some common stem changers with examples are going to be O to UE, such as with the verb poder, to be able to, E to IE, like entender, to understand, E to I, such as pedir, to ask for, or decir, to say, U to UE, used only with jugar, to play, and I to IE, used only with adquirir, to acquire, and inquirir, to inquire. While there are many stem-changing verbs, one thing we can keep in mind is that the original stem is going to be retained when we conjugate for vos, nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, and vosotras. There are also some verbs, such as tener, which have their original stem in the yo form, but change their stem in the other forms. Now, the other way that verbs can be irregular is by using a different ending. While there are definitely patterns that can help us here, again, we have to temper our expectations and understand that many of these conjugations will just have to be individually memorized. Sorry, still. One thing you'll notice is that oftentimes the yo form is the only one that changes its ending, and the rest of the conjugations follow the regular rules, sometimes combining with stem changing. Some examples of these are tener, to have, which gives us yo tengo and tú tienes, hacer, to do, or to make, which becomes yo hago and ella hace, saber, to know, which becomes yo sé and ustedes saben, dar, to give, which becomes yo doy and nosotros damos, decir, to say, which turns into yo digo and vosotros decís, and poner, to put, which gives us yo pongo and usted pone. Are you noticing a trend with these verbs? Although they're all irregular, they're very common verbs we use all the time in English, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to practice them in Spanish. Now, be warned, there are a handful of verbs that are so irregular that they don't just change their stem or their ending, but the whole entire word changes when it's conjugated. Two of the most common ones are ir, which means to go, and ser, which means to be. The conjugations for ir are as follows. Yo voy, tú, vos vas, él, ella, usted va, nosotros, nosotras vamos, vosotros, vosotras vais, and ellos, ellas, ustedes van. Our other highly irregular verb is ser, which conjugates as yo soy, tú eres, vos sos, él, ella, usted es, nosotros, nosotras somos, vosotros, vosotras sois, and ellos, ellas, ustedes son. I'm going to do another video sometime to get more into the nitty-gritty on the most common irregular verbs in Spanish. But that video will explain all of the tenses for those verbs, and we need to understand each tense on its own first. Until then, I highly recommend using the website SpanishDict.com to check out the conjugation forms for any new verbs you learn. They're not a sponsor of this channel, but I feel like they're a very useful resource for learning word meanings and verb conjugations. Any conjugations that are irregular are shown using red letters, whereas regular conjugations are written all in black. So it's a great resource to help you familiarize yourself with verb conjugations. Well, that's going to wrap us up for today. We've talked a great deal about how to conjugate the indicative present tense, but that's only one tense out of about 23. So we still have a long way to go. I'll be posting a lot more videos soon, so if you've enjoyed today's video and want to see more, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you so much for watching through to the end of the video. Adios!